I'm Matt O'Neill, former U.S. Secret Service Deputy Special Agent in charge of cyber operations. In this series, I go inside the fight against cybercrime, hearing directly from the defenders in government, infrastructure, and enterprise who are racing to stay ahead, because cybercrime isn't slowing down, and neither can we. Welcome to Detonation Point, presented by Elastio. Today's episode is really one that I've been looking forward to because we have our guest, Carole House. And I met Carole at a conference about 2 years ago, and I was immediately captivated by this is probably one of the most knowledgeable and intellectual individuals that we have in government at the time fighting the fight against cybercrime. So, Carole, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to become such a force, my words, in the sort of the national strategy to combat cybercrime generally?
Well, high praise coming from someone like Matt O'Neill. So I'm so thrilled to be here and talking to you guys about this issue that I feel so strongly about, especially because I was very surprised by how my career path brought me here. I don't know if your career path actually, because I know you spent so many years at the Secret Service, but mine was a patchwork quilt, an unexpected path and route of a bunch of different national security issues. I actually started in the Army as a chem bio rad nuclear defense officer, which might sound cool unless you've been in the service, in which case you know that that's all the gas mask stuff that like nobody really likes very much. But it is cool, like especially when you're in a striker brigade, like I was in. You're in the operation shop, and so I basically got to be an assistant operations officer with a bunch of infantry and armor captains, and then of course the major and then commander that we worked for. So much fun. And then I switched over to be intelligence, a collection manager. So managing all the assets that watch and listen to people, which I promise sort of comes back around and I think really helped color how I viewed my role at places like FinCEN, which I'll mention in a sec. But after that, did the Presidential Management Fellowship coming out of grad school, which is a program that no longer exists, but it existed to be able to help people like on ramp into the government coming out of grad school that were seen to be future executives. And OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, the small little quiet office of the White House, was standing up a cyber and national security unit. And I was not cyber. If you had told me when I was in the Army that I was going to work in finance or cyber, I never would have believed you. I remember laughing at my soldiers in Afghanistan when they were talking about like buying this Bitcoin nonsense. And I was like, oh, who wants to, invest in something that isn't backed by a dollar? Anyway, they didn't listen to me, which good for them because they're much, much wealthier for it. So I was no visionary on the future of money way back then when I was in the Army. But when I was coming into civilian government, they were looking for some national security people to come in and specifically like wanted me to come in bringing my national security background into the cyber office. So that was my first real touch point and dive into hard cyber kind of work. So we oversee federal civilian agencies and their cybersecurity posture. Then I spent some time at Senate Homeland, and then I went to FinCEN, which you're very familiar with, the anti-money laundering regulator at Treasury. And I learned that it's this bureau that hunts down money launderers and terrorist financiers. And I was like, that's cool. Do you have a cyber section? Yep. So went over there, ran their cyber cryptocurrency and identity policy for about 4.5, 5 years, which is really important because when you get into cyber at Treasury, you inherently get into cryptocurrency because this issue that I know you understand, a Secret Service really understands this, especially amongst many of the law enforcement agencies. I feel like you guys and IRSCI really especially see cybercrime as inherently a financial crime. In most circumstances, almost all circumstances of cybercrime, whether it's like oftentimes very early in the cycle of financial crime where it's trying to steal monetizable data or harvesting credentials in order to eventually use in the conduct of fraud, whatever it is, or cyber-enabled extortion like ransomware, cyber and financial crime are just integrally linked in most cases. And so being at Treasury really helped underscore that, and it was a wonderful place to bring in again that nexus of national security background in with financial, in with cyber. And then of course at the turn of the administration for President Biden's term, ransomware was really rising as a national security issue. I was asked by the National Security Council to come aboard and lead us standing up the U.S. counter-ransomware campaign, as well as drive a bunch of work on cryptocurrency, like President Biden's executive order on digital assets. So I came aboard there. Then I spent a couple of years out in industry at a venture firm doing some other stuff. Like I was chairing CFTC's Tech Advisory Committee and advising some other regulators. But then I went back into the NSC when the administration asked me to return based on some critical infrastructure measures and other cyber defensive measures for the federal government that we needed to drive, which was issued in an executive order at the end of the administration, and continue to do some counter bad guy stuff on crypto. So that's my whole career arc. I know it was a lot, but it's been really fun to work at the nexus of a bunch of different things. And now, of course, doing advisory and board work. I run my own consulting practice, Penumbra Strategies, and just helping nonprofits and companies that want to get strategic tech and national security right.
Well, I always think that folks that have diverse backgrounds make the best sort of thought leaders as it comes to cyber, because you can bring other experiences in to this game that others who just only been doing this get so sort of narrow focused, get the confirmation bias, and only know what their little small universe is. So this is an odd question, but if you were able to go back in time to 2011 timeframe, then you were the director of FinCEN, or you were in Congress and you had the power to make legislation, do you think, in hindsight, we could have done anything better on regulating cryptocurrency?
So I really love also that you went back to 2011, because that means and many don't, that's when FinCEN and the US Treasury really ensured that we regulated cryptocurrency and any value that wasn't necessarily legal tender. A lot of people called cryptocurrency the Wild West, and even if it behaved like it was, that did not mean that there weren't rules, just enforcement is a whole other issue that I think we'll be talking about. But ever since at least 2011 have regulated cryptocurrency in the US. So really the earliest regulator around the world, especially for AML purposes, but really for others too. And FinCEN has long been lauded internationally for its clarity of regulations and the vision and foresight of the great people that were there. And I was not there. Like, I changed my whole career and came to Treasury after a brief detail there from the White House, because I recognized how visionary they really were, and that this was clearly going to be the future of a lot of money, but also a lot of exploitation by illicit actors because of the current state of the tech and the industry. So I do think that from the policy perspective, they really did a brilliant job creating definitions and broad frameworks that really allowed for covering this. Do I wish that maybe Congress had codified some of it in law, even though I feel that Treasury had its full authority, but in the end, based on some of the issues that have been being duked out in courtrooms, I do think that there were some things that I wish had maybe been codified in some more clear ways in law. But ultimately, I think that the 2011 rulemaking and 2013 guidance from FinCEN was great. I think our greatest challenge is really that we didn't focus on early and often enforcement and shaping. So I think if I had been in charge of FinCEN on the cryptocurrency side and emerging tech side, really recognizing the need to build up FinCEN had some of the smartest people in the world on this issue, but I do feel that what was desperately missing from the sector was this shaping early and often that I think is needed on the enforcement front. And I know that that sounds anathema to what industry wants. But early and often enforcement doesn't mean taking down kind of actions. I don't want actions that are taking down an entire institution. I don't want historically large enforcement actions, because if it's historically large, that means I allowed an historically large amount of illicit activity to potentially go through that platform. Optimally, we're trying to shape a sector, not break it. And which wouldn't have started as early as 2011 necessarily. I do think that there were certainly actions that could have been taken, and we took a few. There were a few actions that happened earlier on. I think Liberty Reserve, a designation, was in 2013, maybe 2014. And then BTCE was 2017. But honestly, there was a lot more illicit activity that was happening earlier than that. And even law enforcement cases, we were bringing cases many years after the fact. If you look at the number of years of citation, and this is a problem that I even have just now. We just published a settlement with a crypto mixer that cited activity from 2014.
Yeah.
This is a problem. It should not take us 11 years to take these kinds of actions. So ultimately, I think that enforcement, which is both civil and criminal, and figuring out what a strategic framework is of leveraging data, both publicly available, commercially available, exquisite data, FinCEN reporting, just law enforcement reporting. I don't think that the federal government has figured out a good way to leverage all the different pieces of data that federal regulators and law enforcement have, along with state regulators and open source, to enable more consistent oversight of what's happening in markets. And that's a problem more generally, that goes beyond just AML and beyond crypto. But I do think that this issue of us not being able to monitor what's happening and then bring corrective action in real time enabled a lot of non-US companies to rise to be some of the largest and like the largest in the sector and to be not great examples of compliance and security. So I think that we missed an opportunity for practical implementation. On the policy side, I think that we got it pretty right, actually. I think it was all about implementation that I really wish there had been more focus on that kind of consistent oversight and modernization of our oversight capability.
What was interesting to me and during that time frame, 2011, 2012, 2013, is I was a case agent up in New England working cyber crime cases, talking to bad guys doing undercover activity. And it was right around the time that they, Secret Service and IRSCI took down Liberty Reserve, and then almost in mass, all the cyber criminals I was dealing with wanted to get paid in Bitcoin. And I would go down to a bodega in the South Station of Boston, right across the street, and put in hundreds into a Bitcoin ATM. At the time, Bitcoin was trading at like $110 a Bitcoin, and then it was a pseudo anonymous way to send money. Which I'm not crypto, like I'm not negative on crypto. I'm more agnostic to it. It's a reality that exists
I
today.
think you're realistic.
Yeah. But one of the things that you can clearly see, at least tell me where I'm wrong, is two crimes that really benefited from cryptocurrency: ransomware and pig butchering.
Yes.
So in 2017, when we started at the Secret Service, the Global Investigative Operations Center, the reported fraud losses to the IC3 was 4 billion. Last year it was 16 billion, and a lot of that was in crypto investment scams and ransomware. In your mind, being a much more knowledgeable person on ransomware, how much did cryptocurrency play in the huge explosion in ransomware? Or am I just seeing that as just like, well, that was just a payment system, it would have happened regardless?
Yeah, I love this question because I'm sure you've seen the same comments. Like a lot of people who were in very senior roles inside of the government, people that were in law enforcement and national security roles, some people like there are many voices that have stated that ransomware would work better if they relied on TradFi or traditional finance, if you're not familiar with that term. And I'll tell you, I believe that that is patently false. Like, I completely do not believe that ransomware would have scaled to become really sophisticated ransomware as a service economies that have specialized now in people that are like doing HR management and recruiting and like designing of the exploit kits and doing recon and negotiating, like all these different specialized services. That's really scary that that is the level of industrialization and sophistication that some of the efficiencies that digitization brings, which brings lots of good stuff too, but on the illicit side has totally like enabled the taking off of these really sophisticated cybercrime as a service economies. They would not work without crypto. Like Russ Ulbricht, what didn't say by accident, the creator of Silk Road, that he wouldn't have been able to do any of that without Bitcoin. Like that was true, and it stands true. And so my issue with what's been taken on that particular talking point is that I'm sympathetic to the fact that people highlight that for those not as familiar with cryptocurrency and blockchain, some people thought that it was anonymous, and it's really more pseudonymous. It's that a lot of these transactions, the provenance, like where they come from, where they go to, basically it's published on this unobscured ledger. So of these like first these like alphanumeric strings meaning a person, like that's why it's not anonymous, because you can kind of see the provenance and the destination, but it's pseudonymous because you don't know who owns that wallet, who's on either side of that transaction. So that's why it's really a pseudonymous thing. But people highlight, so this is good because cash, Fedwire, Swift, chips, like the payments rails that we have in TradFi do not publish to public ledgers. So we should be able to dare criminals to launder on public ledgers or public records. I wish that we had scaled the sophistication of our analytics, information sharing, compliance, and law enforcement regime, because it takes all of those things to work together in harmony for that to be the reality. But that's not what we've done. We have not done that. We are not at the state of enforcement. We just talked about like potentially decades-long timelines. I mean, the enforcement action against the largest exchange in the world took 8.5 years, I think is what law enforcement said. That is not a timeline that's effective for deterrence in this space. So that timeline hasn't been working. there really isn't meaningful like progress that's been made in industry to enable timely, proactive recovery of assets and detection of illicit transactions at scale that's actually like resulting in scaled compliance globally. We've certainly seen the rise of reg tech firms, so regulatory technology or analytics capabilities that can help investigators, but that doesn't, if it's not paired with compliance on the other side and across industry, doing things like proactively detecting and having to share information and like this is, then it's not useful and it's not helpful. So I do not believe that ransomware as a service economies or that pig butchering, if you're not familiar with that, it's the like crypto confidence scams and investment scams, leveraging romance or friendships, or when you're getting text messages. I've gotten like how many of them on all of my messaging apps today. It's like, which there's something very darkly funny about, like in talking about fighting crime to still be getting scam messages. But yeah, I just think cryptocurrency has, it's the features of being able to send a wire transfer from my pocket to yours anywhere in the world, which potentially sounds very attractive for a lot of licit uses, but for illicit actors, it absolutely was hugely attractive. And those use cases have just been explored and exploited at a greater scale than industry and governments have scaled to be able to combat them.
And it enables fraudsters to move outside the traditional safety nets that we have to identify money laundering activity. And it's always been believed that the percentage of ransomware victims that are reporting it to law enforcement is pretty low. But if they had to actually send a wire to Rafis Bank, then all of a sudden alarm bells go off and they could be much more exposed. But the problem that seems to me that ransomware, we haven't solved for it in any real meaningful way. From recognizing that most of the actors are located in places around the world that we can't really easily get after, and we look upon private industry to try to help solve the problem. But every single day, there's a new report of a big organization that got hit with a ransomware. What are we doing wrong?
It's a great question because it's one that we asked ourselves every day when we were standing up the counter ransomware campaign for the US government, because we saw this issue, which first off, like just the idea that like ransomware was rising as a major issue and a concern. Ransomware is cybercrime, which means that traditionally it had always sort of been under the umbrella or the bucket of law enforcement primary or exclusive focus and attention. And that's a problem when now, in my view, lots of different kinds of cybercrimes are like worthy of national security attention, and a lot of things do. But I understand that in a world of limited resources, we're trying to figure out what to prioritize. I remember when people in the NatSec community were saying, "Oh, ransomware is just the buzzword. Like it's just like it's not really, like, we'll be worried about another thing next week." And I'm like, no, ransomware is the most pervasive form of disruptive cybercrime that is taking down critical infrastructure and affecting Americans daily. That's why, at the level of the National Security Council and not just other national security agencies that still cared about things like business email compromise fraud and other things that certainly at places like FinCEN we cared about, but it's why cyber fraud has faced an even bigger challenge of being raised to the level of national security threat and wide-scale cross-US government coordination than ransomware. Like, it finally took around 2021. And especially the case of Colonial Pipeline, which was trial by fire. It happened 6 weeks into me at the NSC, right as we were standing up the counter ransomware campaign and our strategy. Basically, it's because BEC isn't taking down pipelines. Ransomware is. So that's like one issue that I think first we needed to be able to elevate it in priority to then bring to bear the weight and power and resources and strategic thinking that you get for the entire US government to come to the table for it. But it's been a real challenge. As you mentioned, like a huge proportion of ransomware operators are Russian. Like there's a reason why that fall we started the White House Kremlin dialogue between President Biden and Putin. This was before the continued invasion and war of aggression in Ukraine. But basically to try to see, could we try to get some level of meaningful action with Russia, and even with like some certainly it's it would be hard to not be skeptical, but really trying to, right? Like we were working on things like the Cybercrime Convention and like basically an international agreement for jurisdictions to take action on illicit cybercrime networks that are operating from within their jurisdiction. This is an interesting place where like I feel that in the illicit finance domain, we've learned this lesson since the 90s and the creation of FATF that illicit financing in your jurisdiction will fund terrorism in mine. And so we started and created the FATF and this international framework of not just standards, but like evaluation mechanisms and countermeasures that get put in place when you suck at them. We haven't really succeeded in doing that yet at scale in cyber. We have some things, like we certainly stood on the Budapest Convention was a great example, and then now of course the Cybercrime Convention, but like implementation and things like what the countermeasures are that get put in place, an evaluation regime, the kind of sophistication that you get with the FATF. Like there's specific groups that you have, like GFCE and others on the cybercrime side, but they're not really at the scale of sophistication that you get with like Egmont group of financial intelligence units and with the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, which is sort of like the UN for anti-money laundering, if you're not familiar with it. I bring this up just to highlight that, like, I think that there's some interesting lessons. There's interesting lessons that the cyber world can and should be learning and has been learning from the financial world, and the other way around. Financial needs to learn from cyber. So this is an interesting one where I feel like cyber has some lessons to learn. But I feel like, and that underscores some of the challenges and why we're having a hard time dealing with these networks. Now, we've definitely taken a lot of action, and I do think that there's been progress. That doesn't mean it's been good enough and scaled enough progress to really make a significant dent. It has been interesting to see certain trends. Like there have been times when the ransomware payments have gone down, so the amounts that people are getting hit with have fluctuated. Numbers, though, continue to be a major problem. And it has been interesting also to see a transition in the kind of extortion that's happening. Some groups have transitioned away from disruptive ransomware and moving over into data extortion only. A lot of them also do like double and triple extortion where they're doing both. But it's been interesting to me. In fact, this is like, it's more of a theoretical question. To what extent is ransomware, if it's just about data extortion but isn't actually taking down pipelines, does ransomware end up sort of back into the same level of prioritization as like BEC and other kinds of frauds like pig butchering, which to me, like, very important from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, right? Like I care about all of it. It's all financial crime. But I've been wondering, like, if things transition significantly, like would that sort of change and drop ransomware as a top concern and threat? There's still, most of it is still disruptive, which means it remains at the top. But I've been wondering, like, when it ends up just being financial extortion, I've been worried actually that it would end up being deprioritized to the same level that other kinds of cyber-enabled financial crime have just had a hard time getting past the threshold of like law enforcement tools only, right? Like our ability to really dismantle and take down the key enablers and infrastructure on the technology side and on the financial side really being the key places that we wanted to prioritize our actions. But it's just tough to maintain that sustained pace of operations, especially when resourcing has been a really, really tough issue over the years and now is really, really bad for law enforcement and enforcement and national security agencies. So anyway, that's a lot of issues that map out part of why we've been having a really hard time, I think, making the dent that we want to against ransomware networks.
One of the things that when I was with the Secret Service that we focused on was the third-party money launderers that enabled, basically as a center of gravity, that enabled cybercrime to flourish, because the third-party money launderers that were moving money for ransomware actors were moving money for DPRK actors in Operation Fast Cash, and they were moving money for BEC actors. And when the reality is that we could not arrest in any meaningful way enough of the people to make some sort of disruption effort, you had to go after the money and just follow the money and do seizures wherever you could, arrest wherever you could, but really target those third-party money launderers. I also think that, and it's more of a statement than question, I think that one of the reasons why ransomware remains a priority is because it affects organizations. And those organizations are businesses that have influence, whereas pig butchering is individuals and it's spread out amongst thousands and thousands of victims, obviously disproportionately losing more money, but at the same time, there's no lobbying group of any significance that is powerful enough to say, hey, we need to stop this because it's not affecting the bottom line of a business.
Exactly.
And so it's going to continue to grow until you hit this point where it's just such a massive tsunami. I think we're already there. But when it comes to ransomware, one of the things that I used to jokingly say, hey, let's let the Bureau choke on the actual ransomware cases. Let's just follow the money, because it was just a thing where, can I arrest somebody? Yes or no? Can I make meaningful change in it? Yes or no? We had very limited resources. in my former agency. So tackling a giant ransomware affiliate, we helped support it by following the money. We had some of the best people that followed the money, but at the same time, going after that takes a lot of time and resources and has to engage other parts of government, not just law enforcement. But from the perspective of businesses that continue to get hit by ransomware, whether they're large or small, they don't seem to really have what are our frameworks, our cybersecurity frameworks wrong? Like how do we not have more robust mechanisms to help businesses identify and recover quickly from ransomware?
I think this is where the risk calculus isn't landing with some people and executive teams. When it comes to like nation state actor targeting, to a certain extent, I understand why a lot of industry feel like, how can you defend against, in the physical domain, Matt, I'm sure you don't have a THAAD system in your backyard. You don't have to spend a dime setting up a THAAD system to defend against Iranian missile strikes in your backyard, right? We do expect Americans and industry to defend themselves against state actors in cyberspace, which is a really interesting, like, difference in paradigm. Now, that is necessary. That is necessary because we definitely don't want DoD and NSA on all like civilian networks. There's a whole host of reasons, including privacy, like resourcing, because the taxes that would take is not something that we're willing to eat. Like, there's huge reasons for it, but it's a really tough thing for people to want it, to be able to accept, and it is tough and sophisticated. But I will say that with ransomware, most of the vectors of attack are the lowest. It's the easiest way in, and it's the lowest common denominator. Identity access management and privileges controls are so often the root cause of ransomware exploits. It is people not patching. It is multi-factor authentication not being implemented. So in most cases, as an institution, if you implement some of the basic, these are the measures that like NSA has put out as top mitigation strategies, CISA has published it, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. In so many cases, it has been just not implementing cybersecurity best practices. But in other cases, it is also not recognizing the mindset shift that many organizations I know, and certainly Alastio and others, and Matt, you've always highlighted this, that like this is part of readiness and resilience is getting ready for that moment when you do get hit. And it's having those backups, those immutable backups. It's also recognizing that the threat landscape is evolving and transitioning to even want to render those backups moot. So it's doing your own like threat hunting and activity on your networks to try to make sure whether or not these illicit actors are getting onto your systems. So I think that there's a level of sophistication that I know that like tiny water utilities, their level of capacity looks different from like really major banks or energy utilities and providers. Unfortunately, that's also why we're seeing things like ransomware targeting hospitals and stuff. Like the healthcare sector is known for having poor cybersecurity, unfortunately, because they're focusing on other things, which is keeping people alive and healthcare. But ultimately, that's also why it's a critical resource that the criminals have been relying upon being able to extort them into paying a ransom because they feel that they need to continue to operate. So this issue, it just continues to be a major challenge of like trying to figure out how to help scale the implementation of these basic measures across industry that in some cases are because we're not implementing the most basic requirements and controls. And then ultimately, I think that we're not communicating as well as we need to the executive and board levels about the potential risks here, but also that these are addressable issues that we can put in place, the defensive and prevention measures, but then also the resilience measures to render it moot if you ever do get hit. And then ultimately, I think that we're messing up because we're diminishing national level coordination and even doing things like the liability protection that ISACs, Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, run on is in danger of lapsing right now. Like, I think that maybe the renewal actually just got put into the CR, so maybe we're okay for a couple more months, actually, which would be really good news. But I was just quoted in an article about this recently because I'm really worried. Like, there's a lot of people that want to change and shift the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act protection on the Hill for different reasons on the House and Senate side, and there's still a huge amount of work that has to be done between different committees and on the Senate side for the bill that was proposed on the House. And basically, if we're taking away national coordination, we're also taking away a lot of grants and capacity building abilities to help the states enable industry and oversee industry to make them better. So we're not sort of pairing carrots and sticks together to create the right market incentives to drive better cybersecurity. And then we're potentially endangering the last line of defense for industry to be their own last line of defense, which is what this liability protection for sharing cyber threat indicator information with each other is. So I'm really worried that on the national scale, we're not helping industry to better like defend against this at scale. Certainly like under the last administration, and I hope continuously, law enforcement is still doing things like we did pre-notification to victims in Hive, like the Hive takedown included a lot of that work that was great, but we need to focus on better cybersecurity, but we're rolling back regulation, we're rolling back national coordination, we're rolling back all these different measures. If they're not being paired with other meaningful market incentives, I'm not seeing the kind of measures and defensive posture that we need to build the cyber and digital phalanx that we need for like to fend off these really institutionalized, sophisticated laundering and cybercrime networks that are targeting Americans and critical infrastructure, not to mention things like Chinese state actors that are pre-positioning on critical infrastructure networks for potential disruptive impact. Like, there's so many things that I think that we need to be focusing on. And so I hope that some of those will be focused on in future legislation, and also in initiatives at places like CISA and, of course, the critical infrastructure agencies. Right now, I'm just seeing a lot of drawdown of capability and capacity. So I'm very worried about the state of our defensive posture.
And you're right, especially as it relates to law enforcement too, where Hive, TrickBot, Emotet, those were opportunistic. You got access to command and control panels. That's not a strategy. That's just getting lucky, and then you kind of help as many people as you can. You're able to find decryption keys, but again, it's still not a strategy. It's just more good law enforcement, opportunistic, helping people where they can. I used to make a lot of those phone calls myself, and trying to get victims to believe that you actually are victimized is also a problem. They would hang up on you, so then you'd have to have an agent go out and see them in person, and it was just, again, it was not an effective sort of scalable strategy. Curious about this. Do you think that the increase in cyber insurance had a detrimental effect on ransomware payments because bad actors knew that there was money, and in many instances they knew how much money, because if they had access to the network, they had access to the policies? Am I crazy on that? Or like, it seems like when cyber insurance started to really take off, so did ransomware.
Yeah, we actually have gotten that feedback from industry, including highlighting that like literally sometimes criminals will look at whatever the policy is and will target that. Sorry, like it's not only funny in a gallows humor kind of way. Like it's terrible. Basically, these criminals are they are sophisticated in a lot of ways. This is why they're being so successful. There's been a lot of debates around the moral hazards of cyber insurance. I don't think that cyber insurance is inherently, like, it's certainly not inherently evil or illicit, but like, I do believe that insurance, for it to create the right market incentives, needs to be calibrated properly. And actually, like, coming from a regulatory and other roles inside of government perspective, there's really two key sectors that the government likes to look to see, like, how are we doing in assessing and managing and mitigating risk in an industry? And that is investment and insurance. Literally, like, the two sectors that focus on things like measuring risk and then face very real, very present quantitative consequences of that ability to measure risk. And the insurance sector, they were doing great. They were like underwriting huge policies, not doing any checks to see like if you were implementing even some of these basic cyber hygiene measures. And that was going great for them for a while. And then ransomware really started to take off, as you mentioned. And then massive payouts were coming from the insurance companies. And that's where the natural market correction that needed to occur in the cyber insurance space started to happen, that I know, like, you've talked about before, and I know we've talked about. That natural evolution needed to occur. And you saw consolidation in the marketplaces. You saw all of a sudden cyber insurance companies starting to figure out, like, what are the basic measures that I should be looking for, the same way that, like, you know, that houses like expect you to have smoke detectors put in place and other measures to make sure that you actually get covered in that case. So, like, that's a good thing. That means that the cyber insurance sector was starting to evolve to become more of the incentive for improved cyber hygiene versus a subsidy for terrible cyber hygiene, which is what it was operating as. I do still think that there's room to go there. Like, I don't think that we're at a really solidly sophisticated state of confident measurements of cyber risk. I think that that's still a little bit nascent, but there has been huge progress, and that's why you've seen some stabilization in cyber insurance companies and metrics. But ultimately, it's still something that I think companies and economists and others and even and federal agencies still struggle with, which is why like you see a more nascent cyber insurance market versus other kinds of insurance like, you know, car and homeowners, etc. And then of course, like cryptocurrency is a fascinating example of like there's really not at all a thriving cryptocurrency insurance space because in my view there isn't a very mature and sophisticated like framework and industry agreed to and like understanding of how to assess and manage risk in the space, which it's a mix of a bunch of different risks, including regulatory, but also just cybersecurity is a huge problem that North Korea and others continue to exploit, unfortunately, in the space. But yeah, but on this for cyber insurance, I feel you on this issue of moral hazard, and it's something that I continue to hear people concerned about, and there have been many in government that have expressed huge concerns on that front. What I want is a more mature insurance space on that front, which means the ability to measure cyber risk. And there's been work that agencies have focused on that front, as well as industry. And I just want to like hope that there's more investment and kickstarting of really, really smart minds and money into solving that problem, because then you wouldn't have this issue. But I do think that being improperly calibrated, it ended up being a subsidy for terrible cyber hygiene. And I do think that it stoked some ransomware attacks.
One of the things we're all talking about, primarily financially motivated cybercrime. And all of us always recognize one of the best ways in order to combat these top groups, transnational organized criminal groups, is to follow the money. And one of the best mechanisms that we have in following the money is enabling financial institutions to share information with each other under 314B, which was a great idea in practice, but it has not turned out to be probably what the authors of 314B thought it would be. The voluntary nature of it, the fact that something like over 50% of BSA regulated entities aren't even participating. How do we fix that?
Oh, this is a really, really tough one. And actually, it harkens back to the example that I mentioned before of the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act liability protection. I'm going to call that CISA 2015 because that was the law. Basically, the cyber liability protection was passed a decade after 314B, right? Because 314B, why FinCEN loves to call our authorities the section of law that they come from. So it was Section 314B of the Patriot Act. 314B came into being a decade earlier than CISA 2015. But CISA 2015, the act, has been adopted way more successfully than 314B has, right? Now, there's some unique features of how the Cyber Info Sharing Act operates compared to 314B. Basically, with 314B is a lot more closely regulated in that like you have to register with FinCEN. There's a notification requirement that goes in there, some things around like protection of the data. And some of that is probably that like versus the Cyber Info Sharing Act, where the nature of the kind of information that's getting shared is part of what stokes some of the concern, right? Like we have put a lot more protections around the sharing of financial data, right to Financial Privacy Act, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, like hugely more sophisticated thinking and greater controls around sharing of financial data, which is funny since there's still like a massive issue of not having financial privacy just generally in this country. But we do have more protections on sharing of financial data than we do on digital data. We don't have things like a broader consumer data and digital footprint data like privacy law, despite like many people on the Hill and in government advocating for that for years. We don't have that in the US. So I recognize that there's some greater ease for being able to share things like digital footprint information and people being less concerned about doing that. But I am really concerned about the fact that, like, again, in cyber, this is an interesting lesson the other way around, where I need finance to learn the lesson from cyber. In cyber, we learned this lesson for like real-time, machine-readable sharing of illicit indicators, because we learned this lesson that like, hey, it's not actually a competitive advantage for Bank of America for cyber criminals to target Wells Fargo, and for me not to know about it because ultimately they're not really targeting Bank of America because it's Bank of America. They're targeting them because they have money. I have money too, and they're going to come after me next. We learned this lesson in cyber, which is why in cybersecurity we do this, like the sharing of cyber threat indicators and malicious like IP addresses and timestamps and malicious URLs and domains, device IDs, and all these things that help us know when something is illicit. We really haven't done that, even with B. It's not automated, it's not scaled, it's not structured, it's definitely not timely. And this problem that we have of us not sophisticating our financial information sharing and illicit finance detection capabilities and information sharing capabilities to keep pace with the digital age is why we are now facing such sophisticated money laundering capabilities, and why I'm really scared, including in the realms of things like ransomware, but also cyber enabled heists, like the largest heist in history that just happened earlier this year. Not that you would know if you attended many crypto conferences or cyber conferences. Like, I don't hear anybody talking about Bybit.
No.
$1.5 billion in one hack. North Korea stole this. And we're not scaling our ability to be able to recover these assets. Again, back to all the problems of like compliance and partnership and international frameworks and all like these challenges. We've not sophisticated the illicit finance ecosystem to the scale that we have, at least on the information sharing side, that we have on the digital and cybercrime side. Now, we still have problems, obviously, with like taking down illicit infrastructure on the digital footprint side, because we have like huge issues of, illicit actors exploiting and using US infrastructure to pwn Americans, which is why that infrastructure as a service executive order to do know your customer KYC obligations on infrastructure providers that was issued by President Trump in his first term. It was still kind of upheld under President Biden, and it's still sort of in question whether or not Commerce is going to move forward with that. But like, there've been more debates on like, how do we deal with the digital age and digital footprint? Do we impose financial KYC type regulatory regimes to be able to hold accountable bad actors that are exploiting digital infrastructure as it scales in sophistication and speed and reach? Or does that make us kind of itchy to put in place monitoring and KYC practices on digital footprint information when our balancing act of like prevention and detection isn't a surveillance state? It's one that sort of that balances where we're willing to put government requirements and regulation. So like, I guess me highlighting this isn't coming up with an answer. It's me highlighting like that it's really complex issues, and as we get more like there's less space between digitization and commercial and financial activity, and that's confusing things. Illicit actors and adversaries are exploiting those seams very successfully, and we've not figured out how to scale that. So it's one of my greatest points of concern.
And one of the things that always frustrates me to some degree on B and the lack of information sharing or willingness to participate is the two things you hear regularly is one, banks are afraid to use it because they're afraid of getting quote unquote dinged by the regulator. Then when we talk to the regulators, they're like, find me a bank that was ever dinged for participating in 13B. It hasn't happened. We're encouraging people to use 13B. It's very basic steps. We repeatedly tell people to use it. And then you're like, well, okay. So is there just this like, false rumor that banks are getting crushed by participating in 314B and making a mistake? Some of the rules are stupid, honestly. We all could probably recognize that, but it's because of a lack of modernization as to why that they don't make sense. Then the other piece is, which should be cleared up pretty quickly, is when I've talked to banks, they say, well, I don't think fraud is covered under 314B, which to the listeners who don't know, and you're the expert having been there for a long time, but my understanding of 314B is it's a safe harbor to protect financial institutions for sharing information as it relates to terrorism or money laundering. And then, so when you say money laundering requires a specified unlawful activity under a federal statute, and the second one listed is fraud. And so how can you say that fraud, such as crypto investment scams, pig butchering, isn't covered under it? Is that a red herring because they're not losing the money so therefore, why am I going to invest in something? Because until it affects my bottom line, it's not my problem? Or am I
Yeah.
reading that wrong?
No, I personally think it's a huge red herring. I've been in the room with many institutions that made this argument, and then seeing other institutions of equivalent or bigger sizes saying, absolutely not. This is all about, it's really about culture at an organization, and do they want to or not? Because FinCEN has published massive numbers of alerts and advisories highlighting that the immediate step after the fraud is the laundering, right? And the liability protection is for the purposes, is sharing information, as you mentioned, for the purposes of detecting or preventing money laundering. Tell me how sharing information about the fraud is not with the intent to prevent or detect the money laundering, which again would be the next step. Like, sharing information about the underlying SUA is absolutely relevant to that, and any lawyer with their salt would make that argument and it would be defensible. And at FinCEN, we published guidance specifically highlighting that. Now, there is only so far that FinCEN can go. Frankly, like, FinCEN has done about as much as they, I think, could possibly do on 314B, at least on interpretation of the liability protection, because ultimately it's not FinCEN who is going to bring actions here. This is a liability protection, like, from civil litigation. This issue would be duked out in the courts. So to me, any additional clarification would just have to come from Congress and or from like interpretation and case law in the courts. And it's not been tested. Like, no one's fighting this. So like, this is why I think that it's a red herring. Ultimately, I've advocated for many, many years for clarity, for like explicit clarity under the Cyber Info Sharing Act and under 314B, to just make it like as clear as humanly possible that like that this fraud and the underlying and initial SUA or specified unlawful activity is completely covered underneath this. But again, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not their lawyer, but like, I completely do not understand how anybody says with a straight face that sharing information about the underlying and initial fraud is not covered underneath that, especially if you are stating in part of your documents and procedures highlight that the purposes of sharing that is to like prevent and detect that and to combat that money laundering activity. I think that it would be rightfully covered, but ultimately, like, that would have to be duked out in the courts is where that will ultimately be adjudicated. I do feel that some of this comes back to, I never saw anybody being dinged for 314B by examiners. So the whole like argument for regulators, I also am very suspicious of. But let's imagine that that becomes a thing, or that it is in some cases. I certainly don't know what all the prudential regulators were doing, but ultimately this is where I think some of the disconnect or the questions around what is the policy versus the implementation of it. Because again, I don't think it's the policy that's the issue. If there are issues with the exams, then this is a question around implementation, which is either around like, how is the institution implementing this, this control, or where is this around examiners finding you like guilty of, I don't even know what the violation would be in that case related to sharing information on 314B. I don't know what the violation would be cited. But to me, then that's a fix. Like, that's part of what the modernization needs to be more broadly on fixing the way that we examine. I feel that that's part of the fixing on de-risking and other issues too that we've really struggled with, where it's not, people keep pointing to policy, and I like, most of the cases it's not the policy that's the problem. There's no policy at FinCEN that says de-risk everybody, or like that, or that you must bank certain kinds of entities either. Like, it's really about how that's being translated into examination. So if that's the case, then that's exactly the kind of thing that I think that like they're looking for feedback on in the FDIC published request for information. FDIC is one of the banking agencies, if you're not familiar with it, asking for feedback on costs and burden and benefits of the anti-money laundering framework. Like, that could be a burden issue that institutions should be highlighting. But I think most of it's a red herring, and that ultimately the real problem is that like it's voluntary. And so institutions aren't feeling that they get credit for it, or that they don't need to do it. So that's where, again, like, that figuring out if there's a way to give credit for this voluntary thing that would allow other weaknesses in an AML framework to slide. Like, again, it goes back to implementation and enforcement questions. I don't think it's not about the policy. I think the policy totally stands and allows that kind of thing.
Yeah, and the sister component to 314B is A, which, as you know, is mandatory. And for those who don't know, it enables law enforcement to query institutions to identify essentially accounts that they didn't know existed. So, for example, if I'm working a case and I want to find out all of the bank accounts that belong to Matt O'Neill, I can send in a 314A request. And that would go through FinCEN and it would go out to all of the banks that are basically regulated, and they have 2 weeks to respond. That's an area where technology really needs to come into play and fix the delay problem. Because if you're going to batch requests for every 2 weeks and then banks have 2 weeks to respond, now you're saying theoretically you could have 4 weeks before law enforcement even finds out there's an account. And in today's era where money is moving faster than ever, that is no longer acceptable. Do you foresee a time where 314A will be of a renewed priority for anyone in government? Because my understanding is even there are parts of law enforcement that aren't even teaching it anymore because they feel like it's such an outdated, not undervalued. It doesn't provide them any value to go through the act of it. Do you see any changes to 314A in any time in the future?
I will admit that right now, I'm not seeing any signals indicating that it is a priority. It must be, because to me, the undersecretary just gave a speech at ACAMS, which is a big, it's a big anti-money laundering certification org, and there was a speech at this big conference out in Las Vegas, and he highlighted the fact that there needs to be a focus on modernization, but also a big reduction of burden. And honestly, I took most of that messaging and my understanding of what's happening, everything that I'm seeing indicates a rolling back of major portions of our anti-money laundering framework, which is coupled with the dismantling of a huge portion of our enforcement apparatus, both on the civil side and the firing of thousands of regulators and people needed to oversee this space, not to mention inside of law enforcement, layoffs, firings, reassignments, I am very worried, including things like that, focusing and prioritizing violent crimes. I get that, and that makes sense for policy leadership to think about where to prioritize things. The problem here is that with money laundering, as you mentioned, the sophisticated money laundering networks that back up these criminal enterprises, including the violent ones, that's a white-collar crime. And so if you dismantle that capability, you dismantle a really, really effective and critical, important aspect of being able to go after incredibly despicable and the worst national security threats that face this nation. So I'm really worried about that. On 314A specifically, I think that I'm hopeful. I'm daring to hope, and something that I'm trying to give lots of feedback to the government on, and I hope that this will land. And I hope that the feedback that others give in response to the requests for information that have been coming out on detection of illicit activity and costs and benefits of AML will focus on that any of the dismantling of the AML framework that I'm still very worried about will at least be paired with improvements on effectiveness and efficiencies. That, hey, you know what? If we're leaning in on artificial intelligence, you can't get use of AI right without getting data right. And I do think that the 314A and 314B, but I'll talk about 314A specifically. I think that a huge area for improvement there could be focusing on data structures and enabling a lot of the automation and modernizations of IT mechanisms that can allow for some of that sharing of information in a way that really truly reduces burden and enables for that real-time sharing. I hope that things like FinCEN publishing data schemas and taxonomies for the kind of information that we want to get. I hope that they do pilots on things like a structured data attachment to suspicious activity reporting for things like structuring transactions and stuff I think there's so many opportunities, updating the SAR form because good gosh, it hasn't been updated in years. And there's so many opportunities for modernizing that and enabling more enrichment of data and standardization across institutions. I think that there's a huge opportunity for standardization of, and this is something that other experts in the field, someone named Natalie Lobner just published an article about this recently.
Brilliant. Yeah.
The standardization of data. We've never published data standards for what is useful for AML investigations and law enforcement and subpoena returns. We've not ever done that. Why not? Why haven't we? This is a frustration point for me where I want a sticks and taxi. It can be sticks and taxi. I don't care. I want a sticks and taxi for cryptocurrency transactions. There is no reason why we haven't done that yet. And I know that there's some that this is one of my many high horses that I've been jumping between. But this is these are the kinds of things that I think that Treasury could do I currently don't see any evidence that that's a major priority for them, beyond some specific efforts. CI First, what IRSCI has going on, focusing on some efforts and engagement with industry. I'm going to dare to hope that that will cross over into modernization of the AML framework. But right now, haven't seen evidence of it. I really hope that it will be a priority.
So, to close, whenever we get together, I learn so much, and we think alike on many, many, many topics. Is there anything that you're hopeful of, optimistic about? Not hopeful, but optimistic. Do you see any ray of light? Do you see anything out there that you can say things are going to get better when we talk in a year than they are today?
On this front,
Or combating cybercrime, whether it's crypto investment scams, ransomware, anything, BECs, anything.
I am at least happy about investment in AI experimentation and use. There's still concerns that I have in some ways, but I am glad to see that like OSTP just published, which is an office in the White House, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, just published their research and development agenda and their so like R&D priorities for the U.S. government. AI is front and center and a focal point, unsurprisingly, but like that is I do think that leveraging AI for good, because the bad guys certainly are. Like, I mean, Iran and cybercrime networks are already leveraging them at scale. Like, we need to figure out how to leverage them. So I am glad for that. I think that that's going to have to be a major point of positivity. And then otherwise, seeing some signals that fraud is being cared about at a higher scale, which I'm glad for. Like, as you mentioned, this problem of this crime, this pervasive crime that is ruining people's lives and resulting in deaths and of Americans and victims that are killing themselves because they've had their entire life savings taken out from underneath them, and then deaths of the human trafficked victims that are sitting in the scam centers, often in Southeast Asia. Like, this is like there is blood behind these scams, and that is it's a huge issue. And I am glad to see that through additional sanctions actions and other like international takedowns of some major networks, like there was something like an action recently that arrested like over 1,000 people. There was an international law enforcement action. I'm glad for that. I'm going to dare to be optimistic that we're seeing this, that fraud might finally be enough to really prioritize and go after. I hope so. Like, there's still room to go, but I'm going to dare to be optimistic that that is something that the government is seeing and finally might step in at the federal level to coordinate.
What I'm optimistic about is there are people like you, like Natalie Loebner, as you mentioned, Aaron West. There are companies out there that are filling the void in this space, whether it's AI companies that are developing really good human in the loop AI that can be deployed ethically and using subject matter experts instead of just data. And I'm optimistic that the industry generally finds the way when there are gaps, and especially in areas in which it's really difficult, even if the director of the FBI and the director of the Secret Service and everyone else said, we're going to put all of our manpower on pig butchering. It's not going to make much of a difference. We need private industry to come in and help fill the gaps. And so, if there's anything I'm optimistic about, it's we have really good thought leaders that are vocal, that are not afraid to call out where there's improvements that need to be made. And again, thank you so much for joining Detonation Point presented by Elastio.
Thank you. I appreciate your time and all of your listeners. Go get them,
Yes,
guys.
thank you.